Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, your curiosity, and, well, we boil it all down to the key knowledge you need. Think of it as your shortcut.
Yeah, a way to get straight to the heart of complex topics without, getting lost in the weeds.
Exactly. And today we're cultivating, if you will, an understanding of a really fascinating intersection. Hey, garden design in Renaissance Europe and the Islamic Empires.
Absolutely. We've got a great set of materials here. It might seem like a bit of a niche topic at first glance, but it really opens up some surprising connections.
Right. Our listener sent in excerpts from Gardens of Renaissance Europe and the Islamic Empires, Encounters and Confluences. And it's not just one type of source.
No, it's quite varied. We've got scholarly articles, travelogues, first-hand accounts, botanical treatises, architectural plans, even illustrations.
So a real mix. And our mission today, our goal for this deep dive, is to uncover how these seemingly separate worlds actually influenced each other's gardens, how that cultural contact shaped what they thought was beautiful or practical in their landscapes.
Finding those surprising connections, those moments of exchange during the Renaissance.
Okay, let's get into it then. This whole idea of these two regions influencing each other's gardens, it really comes down to cultural exchange, doesn't it?
Precisely. The sources talk about cultural contact, basically, when different cultures bump up against each other through trade, travel, sometimes migration, even conflict.
And that contact leads to.
Cultural diffusion.
Oh.
That's the spread of ideas, styles, technologies, you name it, from one culture to another.
Is it always the same process?
No, the texts mention three main ways this can happen. There's direct diffusion, think neighboring cultures, intermarriage, local trade, easy exchange.
Right.
Then there's forced diffusion, which is usually through conquest. One culture imposes its ways on another.
Right.
And finally, indirect diffusion. This is where ideas travel through intermediaries, like traders covering long distances, or maybe texts being translated.
So for Renaissance Europe and the Islamic empires, which kind was it?
Well, it seems like elements of all three were probably at play to some extent, but particularly direct and indirect diffusion through things like trade and diplomacy were key for garden ideas.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, Venice keeps coming up early on as a major hub for this. Why Venice?
Ah, Venice. Well, think about its location and its whole reason for being. It was a massive trading power with networks stretching all across the Mediterranean, deep into the Near East.
So they were constantly interacting with the Islamic world.
Constantly. They're travelers, diplomats. The sources name people like Luigi Ranchinotto, Giuseppe Barbaro, Andrea Navigero. They weren't just there for business deals. They were seeing different landscapes, different ways of organizing space, different technologies.
And they were bringing back more than spices and silks.
Oh, definitely. Ideas.
Oh.
The sources point out a real Venetian interest in, like, the practical side of things. They observed how people dealt with heat, managed water.
Practical benefits.
Exactly, and there was already a kind of openness, you could say. They mentioned Xenophon Cyrus, a Persian ruler, being admired in Europe as a wise leader and a good gardener. So looking east for models wasn't totally alien.
Interesting.
Plus, Venice had this sort of self-image. They consciously link themselves to Alexandria, the ancient center of learning and trade.
Positioning themselves as heirs to that legacy.
Right, which probably fostered a kind of cultural curiosity and openness to Eastern ideas. So it wasn't just about copying fancy fountains, it was about adopting a whole philosophy of using water and shade effectively. We see that filter into Italian villa gardens, moving away from older, more enclosed styles.
That's a great point, Venice, is this gateway almost.
Okay.
What about influence going the other way, or rather deeper into Europe? The outline mentions Ottoman influences reaching France. That seems less obvious geographically.
Yeah, you wouldn't immediately connect Paris and Istanbul in the 16th century, perhaps, but there's a specific historical reason?
Yeah.
The Franco-Ottoman alliance.
An alliance.
A somewhat surprising one, yeah. After Francis I of France was defeated by the Habsburgs, he allied with the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent against their common enemy.
Politics makes strange bedfellows, as they say.
It certainly did here. And this alliance wasn't just signatures on a treaty, it meant real interaction. Ottoman embassies popped up in France, the French had their embassy in Istanbul.
So boots on the ground, culturally speaking.
Pretty much. And this led to trade in artistic goods, but also, crucially for us, plants. actual botanical exchange.
Plants. Okay.
And even more directly, the sources mention reports now, they say these aren't fully proven, but they're reported of Moorish Ottoman gardeners actually working at French royal gardens, places like Blois and Fontainebleau.
Wait, really? Ottoman gardeners in France?
Potentially, yes. There's even talk they might have replaced some of the Italian gardeners who were fashionable before then.
Wow. That's a direct infusion of expertise.
Exactly. Think about it. A political move opens the door for potentially new gardening techniques, different plant knowledge, maybe even different aesthetic ideas right at the heart of the French court.
That changes things. It makes you wonder what specific skills or styles they brought.
It really does, and it ties into the writings of French naturalists and travelers, people like Pierre Boullon and Nicolas de Nicolay. They went to the Ottoman Empire, they saw the gardens firsthand, they wrote about them.
So they were documenting what they saw.
Yes, and the big question the sources raise is how did those observations, those descriptions coming back to France, influence how French gardens developed during the Renaissance?
It sounds like, despite the political maneuvering, there was this genuine fascination with the Ottoman world, even though, as the outline notes, Muslims were often seen as the enemy.
That's a really important tension to grasp. Yes, the broader context, especially with the Reformation, often painted Muslims as adversaries, infidels. But the French accounts show something more complex.
How so?
Well, alongside the negative stereotypes, you get these reports admiring Ottoman luxury, their organization, their sheer power. Let's not forget, the Ottoman Empire was a superpower.
A mix of fear and fascination, maybe?
Something like that. Apprehension and admiration existing side by side. Nicolas de Nicolay, for example, gives this really vivid description of an Ottoman garden near the sea. It had pavilions, water features, fountains, things the French clearly found appealing.
Sounds quite idyllic.
It does. And this connects to an aesthetic idea mentioned in the sources, mezcolanza.
Mezcolanza.
Yeah, it means mixture, basically. The term was used especially in Spain and France, where Turkish, Moorish, even Indian exoticism became sort of metaphorical shorthand.
How do you mean metaphorical?
Like describing a complex patterned flower bed of parterre as a parterre de Turquie, like a Turkish carpet. It wasn't necessarily a literal copy of an Ottoman design, but it evoked that sense of intricate, exotic beauty. It tapped into that fascination with the other.
Using the language of textiles for gardens. That's quite evocative. Okay, let's shift focus a bit east again. The outline brings up Ebbecock's work comparing landscape art as imperial expression in Mughal India and Renaissance Europe. Can you unpack that comparison?
Sure. Koch's argument is essentially that rulers in both places used the manipulation of the landscape creating gardens, shaping vistas as a way to express their power and ideology. It was an imperial statement.
How were they similar, though? Mughal and Italian gardens look quite different, don't they?
Stylistically, yes, often very different. But Koch points to an underlying similarity in spatial concepts. She talks about this movement of diastole and systole in Italian gardens, the expansion and contraction between enclosed, detailed spaces, and then opening up to wide, expansive views.
Okay, that in and out rhythm.
Exactly. And she sees a parallel in Mughal gardens in the relationship they create between, say, pavilions or tombs and the broader landscape they command or sit within.
So it's less about the specific features and more about the intent behind shaping the land.
Precisely. In both contexts, elite patrons, rulers, wanted to demonstrate their control over nature, to represent themselves and their status by artificially transforming the garden and the landscape around it. It was about leaving an imprint.
And the Mughals certainly left their imprint. What were some of those distinctive Mughal garden features that Europeans would have encountered?
Oh, some really unique things. The sources mention rock-cut elements like huge elephant sculptures carved right out of the rock.
Wow.
And the way they framed sacred natural features like springs, Chashmai-Nur and Vernag are mentioned as examples. They'd build structures around them, often add inscriptions. Emperor Jahangir especially seemed driven to physically mark nature with his presence, his artistry.
Leaving his imprint on nature, as the source puts it.
Exactly.
Did European travelers capture this well?
Some did eventually. Peter Mundy's accounts from the 17th century are highlighted as being particularly detailed and accurate, especially compared to earlier, perhaps more fanciful European depictions.
What did Mundy describe?
He noted the layouts often based on squares, subdivided into smaller squares or rectangles, the charba style. He listed the types of flowers and trees, observed the methods like hand watering. He even described the materials like the carved red sandstone used in buildings.
So really paying attention. It wasn't just a casual glance.
No, quite meticulous. And those square divisions, by the way, they weren't just for looks. They often carried cosmological significance, representing order and hierarchy, which interestingly kind of resonates with the Renaissance obsession with order, just expressed differently.
That's a neat connection. Were all European visitors as meticulous as Mundy?
Not necessarily. Interests varied. Some English visitors, like Robert Covert and Sir Thomas Roe, wrote about the gardens too. Covert mentions houses of pleasure with tanks and fountains, focusing maybe more on the leisure aspect.
And Roe?
Sir Thomas Roe, being an ambassador, was probably more attuned to the status and wealth these gardens represented, but also the economic potential of the land itself. So different
And
angles.
we shouldn't forget the Portuguese, right? Down in
Right.
Goa.
Absolutely not. Portugal had a long-standing presence in India, especially Goa. That sustained contact definitely led to artistic exchange with the Mughals. You can see Indian motifs and perhaps even structural ideas influencing Portuguese gardens back home. The Frontera Palace near Lisbon is often cited as an example showing some of these potential hybrid elements.
It's amazing, really, this cross-pollination of ideas across such distances. Okay, let's bring it back to Italy for the final stretch. The outline mentions Italian Renaissance gardens connecting to the Middle East over the longue durée.
Right, this is looking at the bigger historical picture. The humanist fascination with classical antiquity was, of course, huge for Italian garden design. They were literally trying to reconstruct elements described in ancient texts.
Like what?
Well, things like water channels built right into dining tables based on descriptions by Pliny the Younger,
Who?
or elaborate tree houses which they associated with Emperor Caligula, recreating a lost Roman world.
So, looking backwards to Rome and Greece, but were they still looking east simultaneously?
Yes, absolutely. That connection didn't stop. The importation of plants, especially from Turkey and other Ottoman territories, was massive. Tulips are the famous example, but many others too. This fed directly into that growing Renaissance interest in botany, in collecting and studying exotic curiosities.
And botanical gardens started popping up.
Exactly. The Orto Botanico in Padua, the University Botanical Garden, is a key early example. It was a place for study, fueled in part by these imports from the East. And it wasn't just plants. Italian collections featured Turkish carpets, ceramics, even clothing. It shows a broad cultural interest, a dialogue.
So the garden itself was changing meaning in Italy, too.
It seems so. It was moving beyond just being a private space for contemplation, a hortus conclusus. Gardens started having more potential public uses, becoming places for display, but also for scholarly investigation of nature. It reflects that wider shift in the Renaissance towards empirical observation and study.
Okay, so bringing this all together now.
Mm.
After digging through all these sources, what's the big takeaway about the gardens of Renaissance Europe and the Islamic empires?
I think the key insight is just how interconnected these worlds were, even in their gardens. It wasn't a simple case of Europe influencing the East or vice versa. It was complex, multidirectional.
A network of influences.
Exactly.
That's
A
what- yeah.
network woven through trade, diplomacy, travel, texts, even migrating gardeners, perhaps. It created this surprisingly rich dialogue that genuinely shaped the aesthetics and functions of gardens in both regions. They weren't developing in isolation at all. They were part of a much bigger, interconnected global story.
It really makes you appreciate the value of the sources our listeners shared. They peel back the layers on these connections that you might not normally think about. Garden design seems so specific, but it touches on trade, politics, philosophy.
It really does. And it leaves us with something to think about for you, the listener.
Mhm.
Consider how global interactions today might be shaping our landscapes and gardens. You know, what plants are popular, what styles are trending, how we think